All right, let's get started. Anyone who hasn't yet had a chance to introduce themselves via the chat, please do feel free to go ahead and do so. Always exciting to see, the big range of locations and areas of expertise that people are joining us really from around the world. It's really lovely to have everyone here, and we appreciate you taking the time out of your busy day in order to do so. So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're from. I can see today that we're joined from scholars from Canada, from France, from London, from Prague. So it's really, we welcome everyone that's joined us today. I'm Avi Stamen, the CEO of Academic Language Experts. And I want to thank you for joining us for the latest installment of our Publication Success interview series. In general, for those who are new, during these interviews, I have the pleasure of engaging in conversation with innovative thought leaders in academia about how they're influencing the world of academic publishing. Today, we have the special privilege of being joined by Ivan Oransky. Ivan is the co-founder of Retraction Watch and editor-in-chief of Spectrum, and a distinguished writer in residence at New York University's Arthur Carter Journalism Institute. Ivan previously was president of the Association of Healthcare Journalists and vice president of editorial at Medscape. He has also held editorial leadership positions at MedPage Today, Reuters Health, Scientific American, and The Scientist. He is the recipient of the 2015 John P. McGovern Medal for Excellence in Biomedical Communication from the American Medical Writers Association, and in 2017 was awarded an honorary doctorate in civil laws from the University of the South, Sewanee. I hope I said that right. In 2019, the judges for the John Maddox Prize, which promotes those who stand up for science in the face of hostility, gave him a commendation for his work at Retraction Watch. And that will be the theme of our discussion today, is how to stand up for true and transparent science in the face of hostility. Throughout the session, please don't be shy. Ask your questions on the Zoom chat, and we will try to get to as many questions as possible at the Q&A, which will take place at the end of the session. If you have a more personal question or you want to discuss your specific research, you can reach out to me privately at my email address, which you can all see on the screen, and I will get back to you in the coming days. You'll also have the opportunity to follow up with the Retraction Watch team, and we'll share their information a bit later. The interview is being recorded, so we'll send it. If you can't make the entire thing or you want to share with colleagues afterwards, you're welcome to do so. Finally, before we begin the interview itself, I want to take a moment to share a word about the company I run, Academic Language Experts. Academic Language Experts provides customized translation, editing, grant writing, and publication support services to researchers, scientists, and other professionals to help them produce publication-ready texts at the highest levels. We also help scholars looking for help with their book proposals prior to submission to their dream publisher. We're proud to have helped scholars translate, edit, and prepare their research in over 50 languages. It is our mission to help our authors achieve publication success and be a source of guidance and support throughout their journey. And now, with great excitement, I want to introduce you to Ivan. Ivan, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. Great to have you here.
My pleasure. Happy to be here. Thanks, Avi.
Great. Fantastic. So let's jump right into it. I was hoping that you could tell me a little bit about the journey that you had to, and what sort of were the factors that led up to your decision to launch Retraction Watch, and maybe tell us a little bit about your personal biography as connected to that story.
Sure. So really, and again, pleasure to be here, and really nice to be speaking with people from around the world. It's a great opportunity sitting here in New York. I want to be very clear. Retraction Watch is always has been, and I hope and I'm pretty confident always will be, a partnership between me and Adam Marcus. Adam is like me, a medical journalist, a trade journalist. In other words, mostly writing for professional audiences of healthcare professionals, whether it's doctors, nurses, PhDs, etc. And Adam had broken a really big story. This is going back, now I think it's 13, 14 years. Someone named Scott Rubin. Scott Rubin was a pain researcher, an anesthesiologist, and Adam at the time was the editor of a magazine called Anesthesiology News, which, as the name suggests, is for anesthesiologists. I always joke that they should sort of have as a tagline, the magazine for people who put other people to sleep, but for some reason they never cotton to that idea. In any case, Adam, being a great reporter and very well connected, in other words, in terms of his sources, who he was speaking to all the time in the field of anesthesiology, was hearing about this case and from various journal editors and other people involved, researchers. And then the retractions started happening, but it was a really big story. Scott Rubin ended up retracting 25 papers, and we can talk later about whether that's a big number or not. It sounds like a big number, but actually turns out not to be a record by any stretch. But Rubin ended up going to federal prison here in the US for charges related to scientific fraud, paid restitution, a couple $100,000. And this was just a really big story. And I knew Adam because I've been a medical journalist for about almost 25 years. I trained as a physician, I trained as a doctor, but then left medicine to be a journalist full time, much to the chagrin anyway at the time of my parents, but they came around to eventually. But Adam had, he sort of opened my eyes to the idea that retractions were this great source of stories that really nobody was talking about. I mean, you'd see some stories about things like this. It's not that they were completely ignored, but we thought these are these great stories hiding in plain sight. They tell us something about the scientific publishing process. They tell us something about whether or not science self-corrects, and if so, how well and how quickly. There's a transparency issue because we looked at these retraction notices and they didn't say much about the story, if anything. And I thought, hey, let's write a blog. Let's just start a blog. And Adam said, sure, whatever, that sounds good. I don't know what that means. We didn't really know what it meant. And it turned out that we were onto something without really knowing it. Excuse me. And we had made a pretty colossal calculation error, which is that we thought there were maybe a few retractions a month. It turns out that even back in 2010 when we launched, so this is 11 years ago, there were about 400 retractions a year just from journals, and many more from conference abstracts, things like that. That number is way up now. I mean, the 2021, and they're still filtering, they're still sort of trickling in, but there were more than 3,000 retractions, about 3,200 retractions last year. We can maybe talk about trends and things like that, of course, today. But, so we very quickly realized we couldn't even keep up. And that's not a bad problem to have in journalism. It means you there will never be really a slow news day, as they often say in journalism. It's always a sort of can't keep up news day, which is, I think, what most news days really are when you take a look at it. And we've been doing it ever since. We now have to fast forward quite a bit, we now have a database of retractions, which is and this is not just me saying it, lots of other people who are independent of Retraction Watch saying it, that is by far the most comprehensive you'll find. It has 3 times as many retractions in it as PubMed, maybe as many as 5 times as many as Crossref has. And it's used by various bibliographic software managers like Zotero and Endnote and Papers. We can talk more about all those things, of course, as we go today. But it's, so we've kind of become not just a blog that writes about retractions, breaks stories, and kind of gets picked up a lot, gets quoted a lot by other outlets, other news outlets, but actually what we hope is a great resource for the scientific community, certainly for people writing papers or looking at what they should cite in particular, what they should reference. And that's, it's an exciting and great thing that the opportunity and privilege that we have to do this. Adam and I are volunteers, but it's a lot of fun.
So it's really interesting because I would guess that most of those, most of us sitting in this room probably are under the assumption, or maybe not, that, science does a pretty good job at self-regulating or self-checking because we have the peer review, process in place, and because even after research is published, it's then, put under a magnifying glass and scrutinized by peers, and may go through sort of a review process even beforehand. So I'm curious, it sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like actually maybe that's mistaken, and actually your role and your background as a journalist enables you to uncover, or at least express some of the issues in a clear and coherent manner in a way that maybe scientists wouldn't be able to do for themselves. Is that an accurate assessment?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of leave it to others to, judge our work and sort of talk about our contributions, such as they are. But I would say that this perception that science self-corrects isn't wrong. And I would even argue that compared to many other human endeavors, it does a well above average job. I mean, I want to sort of stipulate that before I go into the details. And the details, as they say, the devil's in the details. Yes, peer review sort of improves what ends up being published. Post-publication peer review, which is sort of where we live more, it's more where we live, also improves what gets published, or at least what's published after it's published. But they're hugely imperfect systems. And I think that what we have learned and even before us, it's not as though we were the first to ever realize this. I think we've just cataloged it every day in ways that people haven't. There are so many pressures and incentives against effective self-correction, against rapid self-correction. It is not the priority for most publishers. And I would welcome being challenged on that with evidence, but the evidence we have suggests that this is not the priority. It suggests that retractions take far too long when they do happen. It suggests that retractions and corrections do not happen a lot of the time when they should happen. And this, I'd be happy to sort of quote data on that. So again, I think we do run a risk of, like with everything else, a false binary where we say, well, peer review isn't perfect. And, we've sort of been sold that bill of goods by some publishers. And I can quote you chapter and verse on that. But, peer review isn't perfect, we should get rid of it. And we'd be the last people to say that. What we say is peer review is not all it's cracked up to be. It does not catch things as often. And the post-publication peer review doesn't do as well as it could. And so what can we do to fix that? What can we do to improve the system, frankly, so that there can be more trust in the system? Because there's a sort of common refrain, well, only when things go wrong, right? And we've seen this a lot during the pandemic and some high profile retractions, only when things go wrong to admit that actually maybe something wasn't going to be caught by peer review. You don't get that on the front end, right? So you buy a car, they tell you the safety and everything else, it's totally top notch, everything else. And then, there's some accident or there's, hopefully no one gets hurt, but there's something that goes wrong. And then they say, oh, by the way, yeah, actually we knew about that. And we just figured we didn't want to complicate the message and tell you the car might only be 99% safe. And that's where we are. And the problem is we're being sold a 100% safe car that isn't 100% safe. And all that does is make the consumer, make the car buyer, in this case, the reader, the consumer, someone who's taking medicine or who's trying to decide what to do about a particular condition, or about just science in general and what to believe, they're going to mistrust everything because we don't have we're not having an honest conversation about what the limitations are.
So that's really fascinating to me, and why publishers aren't interested in self-correcting or doing it quickly. But I want to get back to that in a minute. But before we do, I think there's a more basic question, which is, what is the nature of these articles that need to be retracted? Are we talking about that you opened up with a example of really fraud, and maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that case and sort of what the nature of the fraud was. But maybe you could give us a few examples of what are the types of issues that are found. Is it negligence? Is it fraud? Is it scholars who thought they were using the right methodology but turns out it was mistaken? Or are you actually finding maybe more devious things? And what proportion of retractions are how does that sort of split up?
Sure. So the last really full-scale analysis, if you will, of all retractions was when we launched our database. Science Magazine, their reporters, so in other words, not on the peer-reviewed side, but on the journalism side, did an analysis of what at the time was 18,500 retractions. There are now more than 32,000 retractions in our database. So I'd love it if somebody did another analysis. And that was almost 3.5 years ago, was end of 2018. Excuse me, when this happened, when we launched and when they published the feature piece that included all this. But based on, but the numbers haven't changed all that much, and they hadn't changed all that much from, excuse me, the previous analysis, which was done several years before that. And so about 2/3 of the time, and I'll break this down in a more granular way, but about 2/3 of the time, retractions are due to something that would be considered misconduct. Now, fraud is a criminal sort of, definition. And so I don't use that word lightly. Some of these cases are out and out fraud. I mean, when someone goes to prison, and it's rare, but someone goes to prison, that means that there's actual sort of criminal fraud involved. Most of the time, though, cases aren't brought to courts or what have you, although they are brought sometimes, and those are interesting. But the federal definition of misconduct here in the U.S., which is at least inspires a lot of definitions in other places, is FFP. So that's fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism. So fabrication means you made up the data. Like you didn't do the experiment. You never saw, the patient you claim to, whatever it is. You made it up. That's fabrication. Falsification is you did some experiments. Maybe you did a clinical trial, but you made the data look much better than they actually are. So you might see in cases like that, again, maybe you cherry pick, you sort of do what's known as p-hacking. You exclude, examples or data that don't fit your case or fit your argument or your conclusion. But it's falsification rather than fabrication. Or you do something, those of you who work with, who are either yourselves work in sort of biological wet labs or work with people who run a lot of Western blots, right? So, gels, you'll take the picture, but you'll Photoshop out an image, or you'll copy and paste something, or you'll duplicate, you'll, do things like that. That's all falsification. Then there's plagiarism, which probably I don't have to explain what plagiarism is, but it is responsible for some, decent percentage of retractions. There are cases, and one of the challenges is that retraction notices, although they've gotten much better, still don't always tell you what really happened. There are cases where people just realize after the fact, or someone else realized after the fact, they used the wrong method. Or, frankly, sometimes they ordered the wrong cell lines. We had cases where they ordered the wrong mice. And they, or they, they mislabeled a reagent. They have a shelf full of reagents, and, somebody wrote, PB, they should have written PD or whatever, something like that. And all of a sudden you've actually got the wrong, the results are wrong. So, and that hasn't changed all that much. Although what has changed most recently is the sort of industrialization of a lot of this misconduct. And we can talk more in detail about this if you'd like, but and I'm sure a lot of you have seen, and this may have even prompted your interest in today's discussion, a lot of discussion of paper mills. I mean, this has made it into the international news, into large, news outlets. These aren't new. They have been around at least since about 10 years ago, probably much longer. But suddenly people are realizing what's going on and paying attention to it, and that's a good thing. But we've seen hundreds and hundreds of papers being retracted because they turn out to be from paper mills. And publishers are, I would argue, a bit late, but okay, that's fine. They're doing something. They are either working with people that we refer to as sleuths, people who actually know how to find these things, or they're, sort of taking some of those lessons and creating software, or, is it machine learning, or is it artificial intelligence? That's, sort of all these definitions, but they're actually sort of concerned enough about this to try and find them. I mean, you have, again, cases that we just, again, to get back to the question really about does peer review catch everything? We reported last year on a journal, the Arabian Journal of Geosciences, which one would think is about, I don't know, volcanoes and, earthquakes and the sorts of things. And it turns out also about oil and gas. I mean, that's sort of actually the practical interest for a lot of these things. But there were hundreds of papers in these special issues about running wear, about playing basketball. And we just still can't quite understand what those subjects have to do with oil, gas, volcanoes, earthquakes, and geosciences, except that they were almost certainly through a paper mill, and this paper mill realized, or multiple paper mills realized that there were a lot of vulnerabilities in the peer review system there, and now they're all being retracted. But
Sorry,
this has
Ivan,
led to
can
a
you
lot of retractions. Yeah.
can you just define for us for those who don't know what a paper mill is?
Sure. I mean, I think it's like everything else, when you start to label things, you probably are combining a lot of other, so there are paper mills that literally, someone goes to them and says, I need a paper because that's how I get ahead in my career. And happens all around the world, although more in certain places. And they pay the money and they write a paper for them and they submit it. And the paper mill may even do all that work. There are other paper mills where someone has written the paper, and maybe they actually sell authorship positions on that paper. So the paper's been accepted. We broke a story about this several years ago, about one in Russia, and then more recently one in Iran, where your paper's been accepted. And so in the galley well, not the galleys, but in the sort of last stages of looking at the proofs or something like that, or maybe a little bit before that, you say to the publisher, to the journal, oh, by the way, Avi Stamen is now fourth author on this. And the journal that should be a really big red flag, but it's apparently not. And so they put your name on it. But it turns out, and of course you didn't do this, Avi, I'm making it up, but you paid 500 euros or 1,000 euros, depending on the authorship position, to be on that paper. So they're sort of they one way or the other. I mean, it's one of the ways that, unfortunately, and I think this is sort of bad for the legitimate people in the industry, such as yourselves. One of the ways that this seems to have happened is that companies that on the front end were doing very legitimate things were then sort of in the back room, if you will, doing things that they really shouldn't have been doing, to the point where back in 2013, The Economist did a great story. Full disclosure, a friend of mine was the reporter on it, but great story where in China, they actually had the organized crime had realized there was a lot of money in this. And so they tell the story about how the police raided this one paper mill when they realized what was happening, because it was illegal and because it was fraud. They were throwing bags of cash out the fire escape. It was like a mob movie, like a mafia movie, but it turns out it was just a paper mill. So it's really, I mean, again, as a journalist, the stories are endless.
Wow, that's wild. Who knew that scientific publishing could be so exciting and turned into a full feature film? I will tell you that I have had authors, especially those who are trying to get a discount on our services, offer me authorship before. They'll say, I'll put your name on it, just do it at half price. Or obviously I have no interest yet, and have quickly not only reject those, that offer, but usually tell the clients that it's probably best if they, go find somewhere else, because it's not a good start to a relationship when they're selling off authorship places. So that's interesting. Now, I just want to make a quick clarification. You don't necessarily need to go into depth here, but I'm wondering where the line is, meaning how much are you even bothering with predatory publishers? Like, is there even a point in reporting those, or are you only focusing on legitimate? Because it sounds like this Arabian, Journal of Geographical Sciences is probably, a predatory.
Well,
no, am
careful,
I wrong about
right?
that?
This is Springer Nature, right? If that's a predatory journal, I've got thousands of others to show you. So, is it doing things? And again, this gets back to why I always resist labels, or at least whenever I can, I resist labels. So they're doing things that clearly are bad quality and predatory, you could argue. Are they a predatory publisher? That's a whole other, right? We could spend hours on that. But in the database, we report everything. If a quote unquote predatory journal, or one that's on, say, Cabell's list, or used to be on Bill's list, or what have you, if they retract a paper, we report it. And what's interesting is that a bunch of years ago, some of those journals realized that if they did retraction sort of quote unquote the right way, or the way that seemed most transparent, people like us would write about them and maybe even say, oh, look at this, they're doing the right thing. We didn't quite get fooled by that because we knew the landscape, but people do. The fact that they hadn't peer reviewed the paper, the fact that they hadn't done any of the things that they were supposed to do before that, but oh, we're going to retract it the right way. Again, everything is kind of, frankly, weaponized, including retraction. And so people use evidence the way they see fit. But I will say that just because a paper is retracted doesn't mean, just because the paper is retracted, and I see a question about this in the chat, that people may say, oh, this was political or what have you. It may have attracted more scrutiny because of it, because it was sort of politically charged, or because just more people were looking at it because it was about, say, ivermectin and COVID-19. That doesn't mean that it was actually right. And I think that, I'm much more interested in the papers that should be retracted that aren't, than I am in sort of deciding whether something was purely politically motivated, because I don't see that. I don't see too many cases of that.
So let's go down the rabbit hole with that topic for a minute. Why do you think publishers are not in? I would have, a priori, if you had asked me, I would have said publishers would be the first, body to jump on, wanting to retract papers, because that's their reputation, right? Their brand name and their reputation is based on the veracity and the quality of the research they're publishing. So I would have expected that if someone does poke a hole, they would want to sort of be on top of that right away. It sounds that is very much a very naive assumption.
Well,
and so what are some of the motivators? Like, who are the actors, or what are some of the motivating factors that may push either academic publishing to want to kind of cover those things up, or push them, kick the can down the road?
Well, frankly, you're maybe doing some self-flagellation by saying it's naive, but it's the view that a lot of people have, and the view that I kind of wanted to have for many years, but I don't anymore. The fact is that most publishers see retractions as a mark, as a bad, a black mark, as a bad thing, on their stain on their reputation. And while that is, you can see how that is, but that means that you have another incentive not to retract, right? So people talk about indices of retraction. I think, the journals I trust the most are the ones that have retracted a lot lately, because they realize they really need to clear out the stables. But when you consider that their entire business model, really, is in some way based on the idea that peer review is adding value, right? Full stop. That is what, if you take that away, yeah, you can talk about, well, we're good at marketing the papers, we're good at publishing, we're good at printing them, we can, format them into a PDF for you. Those are all great things that, frankly, I think, Avi, your company does, and lots of other companies do. So, that's fine, and I don't have any problem with people getting paid for that. But the core of this incredibly profitable, and not just for the for-profit companies, but also for the nonprofits of the scientific societies, the core of that, right? If you take away, again, the idea that peer review is adding tremendous value, you're not left with a lot. And so if you admit that, in fact, peer review is missing a lot, it missed all these things that should have been retracted, but we're not going to do anything about it because, then people will know. Their whole systems are not built. Like, even now, 20 years after it's become clear, or 10 years after it's become clear that retractions are kind of an important thing, the content management systems, they're a mess. The reason why our Retraction Watch database, I think, adds value is because we're capturing retractions that even the publishers know about, that they're not transmitting to the indices and things like that. There's the system never prioritizes this, because every incentive in publish or perish is based on publishing more. And so as you publish more, you're going to have more problematic papers. That's not a message that a lot of publishers like hearing or like promulgating. Things change, but this is a central incentive problem for both academia and the publishing industry.
Isn't it ironic that the central point of value that publishers provide is actually a voluntary service that scholars do for publishers, and could, in theory, be done well outside of the framework of the publishing?
Well, it is being done effectively. All of these post-publication peer reviews, right? So PubPeer, right? PubPeer.com, which, again, full disclosure, I'm a volunteer member of the board of directors there. They picked this up, and again, they've been around almost 10 years now. They picked up on the fact that publishers were not interested in hosting or even encouraging discussions of or critiques of what's published in their pages. And so they set up this site where anybody can leave comments about, problematic papers and issues. And it's led to all kinds of retractions and corrections and really robust discussions, including with authors who, might have hidden behind journals before. That's terrific. But the best sort of peer review on a lot of these problematic papers is being done outside. Never mind by the fact that the original peer reviewers don't get paid. Nobody on PubPeer is getting paid.
Right. Now I'm curious. Maybe you could relegate us a little bit with stories, or one or two examples from COVID, from the last 2-3 years because I think that the reason that's important is because I think the stakes are high. I think people have either the stakes are higher or people have realized how high the stakes are, right? Meaning when a problematic, it's one thing when you have a theoretical piece which is published and then 6 months later, a year later retracted, and maybe not much harm is done. Maybe a few scholars have sort of based some of their research, which is also obviously not something that we want to have happen, but may not have major large reverberations. Whereas I think with some of the COVID papers, we're talking about influencing policy, public health officials making decisions based on some of this research. And I think, and general trust in science is at stake. And I think we've all gotten a little bit of a shockwave of, oh, not everyone does trust science. And maybe, that's because maybe that's, are on us, but maybe also, maybe it's on them, but maybe it's also on us. So I'm curious if you could just, give us a few examples from that and how you think, and what you've seen over the last few years.
Yeah, so we've kept track of the number, just the pure number of retractions due to COVID-19 papers, and as of this morning, and it may change by this evening, but it's 207. Excuse me, my chair just did something strange. So it's 207, which I don't know if that's a lot or a little. It's important to remember a couple things. One is the denominator. There have been hundreds of thousands of papers published. So the actual number, the actual percentage is it's probably about what you would expect. It's not really higher. What'll be interesting is, what happens, Gesundheit. But it happens a few years from now, because most retractions actually take on average about 3 years, which, again, is reflective of other things we've discussed today. So these 207, is it a lot, is it a little, don't know. And I think I'll give a couple examples, but I would just underscore what you're saying. The stakes are higher in two key ways. One is that we are actually depending, all of us, the entire world, on the evidence base that these papers are supposedly providing for us, whether that's about, containment measures or isolation or masks or vaccines or, anything, new drugs. So that's really critical. And it means that there are more eyeballs. So of course there are going to be more retractions because there are more people looking. But the other thing I think is actually much worse. I think it's much more pernicious. And it is the long-term effects of the fact that everybody's paying attention when science goes bad. So it goes badly. And I think in the long term, that's really good because it's going to normalize the process of self-correction. I think in the short and maybe midterm, it could be really disastrous because we've been, again, fed this line about how peer review is catching all this, science is self-correcting, and yet it isn't. And now it's being forced to be because there's so much scrutiny. So, great example. There's some really core examples that I'm sure everyone's heard of. The Lancet and New England Journal of Medicine, about a year and a half ago now, both had to retract. They retracted them on the same day, these data. One was both about sort of potentially using drugs for COVID-19. Of course, one of them was hydroxychloroquine, which I'm sure everyone has heard about. That's kind of faded now. Ivermectin has taken its place in terms of a drug that doesn't actually, have any evidence behind it, but that certain people are continuing to push. But that was really because, in a nutshell, nobody knows whether the data exists. There were these supposedly massive data sets that nobody could produce, and that the senior authors trusted existed, but we don't know if they existed. And so those are the most serious ones, I think. But then there's sort of wacky cases. there's, again, sort of some very questionable journals. 5G is responsible for COVID-19, and sort of things that sound just bizarre, but they also can lead to conspiratorial, thinking among the public and among even some researchers. And more recently, there have been some pretty high profile cases, certainly that we've covered about, safety of vaccines, which some of which appear to be just honest errors, people making calculation errors and kind of working too quickly and coming up with figures that aren't correct. Some of them seem to be less well-intentioned, and because people double down when the errors are discovered, or they come out when the paper's retracted, they actually come out with a paper that makes that error 10 times as worse, as bad. These are all, again, 207 of them. We haven't even covered all of them. We have a list of them on the site, which we can provide to anybody, and they're freely available there. But they really run the gamut.
Yeah, Alana, maybe if you could throw up the the Retraction Watch database link, everyone can kind of copy that down and check it out afterwards. So I'm curious. You just kind of threw in as a side point, but it struck me that it takes 3 years on average to retract a paper, and what I translated that in my mind to mean is that there's probably a sort of a like a aftershocks of Rolanda. You don't necessarily need to share it right now. You just put it in the chat. But there are probably aftershocks of other researchers basing their research on the initial faulty research, which does that research then need to be retracted? And why does it take 3 years on average for retraction? Is that because of the publisher being stubborn and needing to be, kind of pushed or coerced into it? Or does it take that long for people to come forward and report it? Like what attributes to that long length of time?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I mean, first of all, yes. I mean, the upshot is people continue to look at these papers as if they were legit. They might send a grad student or a postdoc off to try and replicate it. Nobody can, and it wastes an awful lot of time and resources. Makes people leave science, frankly, because they're like, well, this paper in some journal, and I can't replicate it. I can't, what's wrong with me? Well, turns out nothing wrong with you. You're doing you've got the right result. And that's why we always include, in a paper that's been out more than a couple of weeks, we include the citation information from Claravit, Web of Science to, just show the impact. Sometimes these papers are highly cited papers. The delay, I should be clear that it's a sort of bimodal distribution. So 3 years is the average. We've seen papers, we saw this, and it's kind of a funny story more than anything else, a paper that was retracted 80 years after it was published. I mean, it's a great story, actually. I can tell it later maybe, but we see routinely now 10-year-old papers, even 20-year-old papers, 50-year-old papers every now and then. And so most of those are due to misconduct. So in other words, those investigations, they can take a little while. There's no question. I'm not talking about, oh, you must, act the minute you see something. But also, we reported on a case the other day, a paper that, again, was pretty reasonably cited. It was in a science journal, Science Signaling. And because we filed a public records request, we obtained the correspondence between the corresponding author and the journal. And there are a lot of details to the case, but the punchline in my mind is that the journal knew about this 3 years before they did anything about it. The university and the corresponding author, frankly, did all the right things. Maybe not all the right things, but basically all the right things. And the journal just sat on it for 3 years. And the journal was very honest about that. When we called them to ask them to justify it, they said, we have no excuse, really. But that's the kind of thing that happens because it's just not a priority. So in that time, though, the paper continued to be cited, right? The journal benefits from that. Its impact factor goes up. And again, people are wasting time and effort trying to replicate this paper. And the final thing I'll just say about this is that also, you have to keep in mind that lawyers have gotten involved in a lot of these cases. So when someone is accused of misconduct or accused of something that looks like misconduct, people lawyer up, as we say here in the States and on Law and Order, right? So, so lawyers slow things down. They file motion, they may even go to court, they write sort of threatening letters, they want to change what the retraction notice says before it goes out because they want to make it look like their client didn't do anything. And everyone's sort of entitled to a vigorous defense and the rest of it, but these aren't criminal charges. And it can be really bad for the scientific record when there's no transparency and when things are slowed down like that.
Got it. All right, I'm just aware of time, and I don't want us to run out of time. But I do want to finish off, and then we'll get to some upcoming events and Q&A. But I do want to finish off with maybe a more personal, tips or advice you can give to the authors that are going to be watching, that are watching now or going to be watching the recording. Authors who do have good, I assume do have good intentions and aren't malicious. But are nervous, that they're using the right methodologies and that their data. So are there sort of resources or tips that you can give to authors so that they can double check themselves before they submit an article? Obviously, using the proper accepted methodology in the field is critical. But is there something, maybe a little bit more detailed that you can
Well,
give to us?
yeah. I mean, a couple things. I mean, one is in terms of just making sure that you're citing references that haven't been retracted, you can use our database directly, or probably better and easier to use Endnote if you or Zotero or Papers. If you just upload all everything you've ever read or cited or want to cite into that, you'll actually get free alerts. It's not, well, some of them aren't free. The alerts are free. Endnote isn't necessarily free, for example, unless you have a license or your university does. But they're automated alerts, and you'll get those, and so at least you'll know that. But that's only one small part of it. I think there's a sort of concept of red teams that has come up in various ways. I mean, actually, in terms of politics here in the U.S., but the notion that you should try and figure out how you could be wrong every single day. And you should try and find people who are likely to disagree with you and likely to come up with different conclusions. And you can do the same thing for them, by the way. That's the whole point of this. And send your manuscript to them before you even submit it anywhere. And that can really help. And the other thing you can do is preprint servers, right? So again, that's a whole other conversation, a fascinating and important conversation. I won't get into details, but consider if it works for you and for what your circumstance is. Consider posting your work to a preprint server where people will see it and hopefully comment on it, and if it gets some wide circulation, and then by the time you actually submit it to a journal, you can make sure that it's up to snuff, or at least more up to snuff than it was. Those are just a couple of suggestions.
Yeah, I definitely think that there's my experience, my anecdotal experience is that when I recommend this to scholars, they oftentimes are concerned about a different kind of problem, which is that whoever they're sharing it with then going ahead and stealing their data or research and then publishing it themselves, which is not totally, far-fetched
and that's,
either.
again, it needs to be in a trust basis. But again, that's actually one place where preprint servers can help, because it actually establishes priority. So if someone comes out with something afterward, even if they've quote unquote stolen it from you, you were there first.
Got it. And I'm curious, are the vast, I think we've framed this in a scientific, mainly in the STEM fields. Do you also follow retractions in HSS and
No, we do. There aren't as many of them, and they typically, for humanities in particular, they tend to be. I mean, social sciences depends sort of how you define social sciences, but for humanities, it tends to mostly be plagiarism. We've seen a couple of pretty high-profile cases there, and we do include those. But pound for pound, most of the database, just because that's what's retracted, is sort of biomedical in some way.
Right. Yeah, no, I just came to mind because of there were the authors that purposely, to show a point, I forget their names, but they published, a dozen, tried to publish a dozen papers that were sort of fabricated.
Right. That's that's complicated and fascinating too.
Indeed. Sounds like we need to have a follow-up session. All right. So I'm going to put a pause on my questions for Ivan now. So first of all, I want to share our upcoming events. If you enjoyed this event or you've been to previous events, you'll know that we do this approximately once a month. Coming up next month, Anna, if you could share in the chat and on the screen, so we've got an interview with Christy Henry. Christy is the first female director of Princeton University Press. And we're going to be talking about creating collaborations and cultures of belonging for scholars. And we're going to be talking about, how university press publishing can become more inclusive and really, a big part of that, at least from my perspective, is not just, sort of focusing, honing in on the top Ivy League schools and just publishing, becoming a mill in a different sense of just publishing, Ivy League work, but actually expanding a little bit further and understanding, what scholars can do. So what scholars can do to publish with major publishers, even if they themselves are not in, an Ivy League university. So Alana, if you could share that in the chat, so anyone's interested in signing up, that would be great. And then if anyone wants to follow up, with either Ivan or myself, Alana's going to throw up our contact information up on the screen, and you're welcome to be in touch. And with any either more personal questions or more specific questions that we don't necessarily have time to get to today, we'll try and get through as many questions from the chat as possible. But if there's anything that we aren't able to cover that is interesting to you or that you want to learn more about, you'll have the opportunity to do so. So I encourage you to check out Retraction Watch's site and be in touch as relevant. So with no further ado, I'm gonna go back up to the top of the chat, and we'll see what questions have come in. I will say I wanted to start off with Melanie's question because it was a question that I had planned to ask. What is the typical process for how retractions are instigated? I mean, how does that process come about? I assume it's not, after what you've told us, it's not the publisher coming and saying we've got a problem. Do you find that most cases, is it author instigated? Is it someone external? Are there a team of sleuths that account for the majority of finding retractions? Like, how does that process work? And then let's say, I don't know, I'm a scholar and I'm reading a paper and I'm like, I know this is this is not legit, or I have questions or suspicions about it. What's my recourse? What do I even do to report or learn further?
Yeah, I mean, the fact is there's no process.
Okay. Maybe that's part of the problem.
There's a process, but it's not as though there's here, follow these steps. Now, the Committee on Publication Ethics does have guidelines that are directed at journals and editors and publishers, how they should handle allegations, but that means an allegation gets to them. It's kind of like, it's like evolution, I guess. There's like maybe convergent evolution. There's 100 different ways that these things can happen. I think you ticked off, most of them, if not all of them. Sometimes it is the publishers. Publishers have actually started hiring research integrity managers, which we think is a great thing. It's only a handful of journals that have done this over the past decade or so. But that's one way that people find things. But most of the time lately, it's these sleuths. It's people unconnected to any of the processes, any of the publishers or the authors, who maybe they leave a comment on PubPeer. Maybe they send a note to the journal. Maybe they send a note to the university. When you really suspect misconduct, again, depending on your setting and which country you're in and what the regulations are, sometimes it doesn't make sense to write to the authors because they'll just find a way to cover it up. It may make sense to write to a national authority or to the university research integrity office, et cetera. So if you find something, there are lots of different ways. Again, you can go to PubPeer, you can write to us, you can write to some of the sleuths. We actually have a whole page on the site. It's just about all the dozens of sleuths we've written about. Sometimes it's useful for you to contact them and see if what you think you're saying is legit. And also that they might have their own platform, whether it's social media or Twitter or PubPeer. Sometimes people come to us with these issues because they've been frustrated by a lack of action. And so sometimes we will then pick up the story, given our resources, what we can do. And often what we find is that public attention, public scrutiny is what often makes the difference between someone sort of raising a concern and something actually being done about it. That's unfortunate, we would say, but it certainly provides a reason for us to do what we do.
You're self-publishing, or you will write up a story and publish it with a major news outlet? Like, how does that, or both?
Depends on the interest. We do have relationships with a number of major news outlets, and we have contributed over the years to STAD and to Wired and to Science Magazine. We haven't done that in several years just for various priority reasons, but we will publish some of the big stories with them. Lately, we've been doing it on our own, and then what typically happens is other news outlets pick it up based on our reporting. So we'll file public records requests, like I mentioned earlier, and then we'll publish all that, and then other news outlets will pick it up.
Got it. Lisa had an interesting question here about once erroneous data or information is out there, there's probably another challenge, which even if the journal is super transparent and retracts right away, how many scientists are actually following, maybe if it pops up as an alert on your Zotero, that's an interesting, opportunity, but, isn't the damage done even if it is retracted in the way that it's supposed to?
Yes and no. I mean, again, technology can create issues. It can also get us out of this. So, our alert system with Zotero is about 2.5 years old. Endnote only went live last fall, and I actually be curious whether that has any effect. I hope it does. I think it will, but I'd like someone to test that. Certainly the damage is done in the sense that the paper's been out there. Maybe it was cited a lot before it was retracted. But I think at some level we need to think about, again, the same way we shouldn't be thinking about any false binaries. Let's not think about papers as either completely retracted or, I mean, they are, but as sort of retracted or not. And if it's not retracted, it's okay, because the real problem is a lot of these papers that really should be retracted to continue to be cited, and we don't even have a way to track those. So certainly the damage is done, and certainly there will be people who continue to cite it for whatever reason, and don't mention the retraction. That's really the problem. You want to cite a paper that's been retracted and say that it's been retracted. Okay. I mean, I don't actually have an issue with that, and I don't think most people do. It's when you cite the paper and you don't include the fact that it's been retracted. I mean, I will say that if you compare this to law, the practice of law, you can't do that in the practice of law. I mean, you can. Bad things will happen. You'll lose your case. You might even get disbarred if the judge knows that, finds out you're doing it knowingly. But yet in science, it's okay to sort of do this. That's pretty awful.
Got it. And how does that, is it when an author does face that, I assume it's a disciplinary, like how does that disciplinary, let's say there is an author that really has, something that's had a trend or it's multiple cases of fraud. Is that something that's on the publisher to address, their employer? Like, how does that usually happen? It's interesting because you mentioned that it's country dependent, and that seems obvious, but it reminded me that I was once at a conference with other academic translators, and I was speaking with an academic translator from the Ukraine, and she told me that that predatory journals are not yet banned by the higher education board there. So authors just publish in predatory journals, and they get and it adds to their publications, and there's sort of no redress for that. So how do you? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think, and again, to that point, they're just sort of jurisdictional issues. This is not something that federal or governments of any kind have taken up to any large extent. You see these little pockets. So, for example, with predatory publishing, they're not banned anywhere. It's a question of, I mean, the FTC, Federal Trade Commission here in the U.S. actually went after Omex, one of the largest ones, won a settlement, which I'm sure will never get paid. But that was more than a shot across the bow. That was maybe sort of a sort of torpedo on a destroyer. But I don't think it might not have much of an effect. It was more of kind of a public sort of service. But to the point of like who's responsible. Again, here in the States, we have the Office of Research Integrity, which is at HHS, so that's NIH, and then the NSF, Office of Inspector General, which is, again, they do similar things. One has more power than the other. I won't get into all those details. The point is there are statutes, and in many ways, and I wouldn't say that the US is ahead of other countries in a lot of ways, quite the opposite. In that particular way, we're a little bit more advanced. We actually have federal agencies. That being said, those federal agencies are not well funded. Only one of them has subpoena power. The Office of Research Integrity typically only puts out about 12 findings a year. This past year, they only put out, I think it was 3, maybe it was 4. And this is over a oversight of a NIH budget of $35 billion, right? So, these are underfunded, but at least there's a mechanism. Do publishers have a responsibility? Do universities, there are universities that have begun to license our database in order to do background checks. So because they realized and they were getting caught, or they realized that they were hiring people who had actually had retractions, and they weren't putting them on their CVs. Nobody was talking about it. So again, it's going to have to be, it's going to be a long process, but the more we can increase visibility, and yeah, maybe include some punishments and sanctions, the more will be. I mean, there's a lot of little things happening which we're watching, but there is no central, and everyone kind of, you know, passes the buck. I mean, nobody wants to deal with these things.
Got it. All right. I just want to wrap up with one last, question. I know that this has been fascinating for me. I expect that this has been fascinating for those in attendance as well. So thanks so much, again for your time here. I'm curious what the future of Retraction Watch looks like. Are you sort of satisfied with the database and just continuing to update that and report it, or are there other things, sort of coming up on the horizon that you think can, even take your work even further?
No, we're always interested in growth. I mean, frankly, we're still interested in sustainability, right? We're a nonprofit, as I mentioned. Adam and I are volunteers. We welcome, contributions, donations, and what have you. And one of the ways that we support the work, and we do have one full-time employee who just works on the database, and some other contractors as well who work on that and other things, is to license the database. And so we've been very successful in doing that. I mentioned Endnote, Zotero, papers, some publishers as well, universities. And so that will allow us to grow and to, hire a full-time editor. We have so many stories that we're not telling, not because we don't want to, but we just don't have the resources. We're quite limited. I'd like to get back to, having a full-time editor, being sustainable at that budget level, which, again, we're very transparent about it. Our 990s, our federal tax returns are all public. We publish them. And there are just lots and lots of stories that we know we could have an impact with if we had that kind of growth again, and again, sustainability. So no, and I'm looking forward to the data being even more useful to more people. We give away the license, it's a free license to scholars, and we're doing that about once a week, who then publish papers based on the database. That's happening a lot now. So there's a lot more things we could do even within what we're already doing, just growing some capacity.
Got it. Ivan, I've really enjoyed this chat. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day. I know you're just starting your day, so we really appreciate it. And thanks everyone for coming. I appreciate you taking time out of your day. So yeah, check out the database. Stay in tune. And for what Retraction Watch is doing and up to, because I think you're really doing great work, and it's nice, especially in the academic sector, where sometimes we come in with good intentions and get maybe sidetracked along the way. It's good to know that someone's sort of keeping an eye out, because I think that makes us all better as well.
Thank you. Great to be here, and really thanks to everyone for the questions as well.
Great. Have a great day, everybody.